Welcome back to our study of the Old Testament book of Hosea. I want to encourage you to open your Bibles to chapter 8. That's going to be our focus in this particular lesson. A new section of oracles begins here in this chapter with the theme of rejection and transgression, and including a general description of Israel's sin as an introduction here to a rehearsal of evidence and curses. The passage ends with a description of the judgment of fire that will befall Israel, and Judah there is mentioned as well when we get to that point. Let's dive into the chapter. Verse 1 of Hosea 8 says, "Put a trumpet to your lips. Like an eagle, the enemy comes against the house of the Lord because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law." As in chapter 5 and verse 8 that we studied earlier, the sounding here of a trumpet or ram's horn is a signal of approaching danger. Chapter 5, verse 8 says, "Blow the horn in Gibeah, the trumpet in Ramah, sound an alarm at Beth-aven, behind you, Benjamin." The Hebrew word here translated eagle can also mean vulture. It is a bird of prey, regardless of which specific bird it's talking about. Hosea here employs an image of a bird of prey swooping down on its victim. It seems most likely that it's a reference here to the nation of Assyria, whom God is bringing against Israel due to their sin. Assyria will be the tool of God's wrath. We could compare the covenantal curse mentioned back in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 49. We've referenced Deuteronomy 28 through 32 often in this study, and God here is just referencing once again the curses that he promised would come if they refused to listen to him. Deuteronomy 28 verse 49 says, "The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as an eagle swoops down, a nation whose language you shall not understand." So there we see the picture of a bird of prey, and it's assigned here to this nation that God would bring against them due to their sin. Habakkuk chapter 1 verses 5 through 8, they're speaking, of course, of the Babylonians brought in judgment against the southern kingdom of Judah. Habakkuk 1, 5 through 8 reads this way: "Look among the nations, observe, be astonished, wonder, because I am doing something in your days you would not believe if you were told. For behold, God says, I am raising up the Chaldeans or Babylonians, that fierce and impetuous people who march throughout the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. They are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and keener than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping down to devour rather." So again, you see the picture here of this eagle or vulture swooping down to devour the target. Jesus uses the same picture in the New Testament in Matthew 24 as he speaks of the coming judgment upon Jerusalem and the nation of Judah. Matthew 24 verses 27 and 28 says, "For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." The reason, of course, for this coming attack is stated explicitly here in verse 1. They have they've transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. The reason for the coming attack here, God says very, very clearly, Israel has violated the covenant and disobeyed the Mosaic law. The enemy, in terms of the war alarm, is Assyria, but Israel's ultimate enemy is God. Trouble stems from unfaithfulness to him, political and economic difficulties being simply a manifestation of his lack of favor. Israel deserves, indeed requires, that disfavor because of their disobedience to the covenant. Back in chapter 6 of Hosea in verse 7, God says, "But like Adam, they have transgressed the covenant. They have dealt treacherously against me." Throughout the prophets of the Old Testament, God highlights again the ultimate sin of transgressing the covenant of God. Isaiah 24 verse 5 says, "The earth is also polluted by its inhabitants, for they have transgressed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant." You can reference as well Jeremiah 31 verse 32 and Ezekiel 16 verse 59. Nearly every prophet at some point or another brings up the covenant of God, and God through that prophet says, you broke the covenant, and now judgment is coming. All right, verse 2. God says, they cry out to me, my God, we of Israel know you. So Israel here, if you will, attempts to offset their disobedience by intensified worship. The verb for cry out here carries the connotation of calling out for help. In distress, needing food and security after the disastrous events that had already befallen them, Israel appealed formally to its national God while still flirting with other gods. We're going to see that a little bit later in this chapter, verses 4 through 6 and verse 11. This, of course, recalls the wailing appeals to God back in chapter 7, verse 14. Remember what it says there? Hosea 7:14, God says, and they do not cry to me from their heart when they wail on their beds. For the sake of new grain and wine they assemble themselves. They turn away from me. It's ironic here in verse 2 when Israel says, we of Israel know you. This claim, of course, is in direct conflict with what God has been saying throughout Hosea about Israel all along. For the people of Israel to say that they know God is hypocritical. Back in chapter 2, verse 8 of Hosea, God says, for she does not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, and lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. Then in chapter 5, verse 4, God says, their deeds will not allow them to return to their God, for a spirit of harlotry is within them, and they do not know the Lord. When we get to chapter 11 of Hosea, verse 3, God says, yet it is I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them in my arms, but they did not know that they healed them. So this cry of Israel here in verse 2, God, we know you. Again, it's hypocritical. They're claiming to know him, but by their deeds, they don't. Now, verse 3, Hosea 8, verse 3, Israel has rejected the good. The enemy will pursue him. God notes that Israel has consciously rejected the good, or it could be translated the good one, referencing God himself. Either way, they violated the covenant. Their punishment will come according to a well-known curse. The enemy will pursue him. There at the end of the verse 3. This wording most closely paralleled by Deuteronomy 28, verses 22 and 45, but it reflects a theme mentioned repeatedly back in Leviticus 26 and all of Deuteronomy 28 through 32. Let's just read Deuteronomy 28, verse 22 and verse 45. Verse 22 says, the Lord will smite you with consumption and with fever and inflammation and with fiery heat and the sword and the blight and with mildew, and they will pursue you until you perish. And later in Deuteronomy 28, verse 45, God says, so all these, Moses speaking, so all these curses shall come upon you and pursue you and overtake you until you are destroyed. Why? Because you would not obey the Lord your God by keeping his commandments and his statutes, which he commanded you. So again, these coming judgments of God shouldn't come as any surprise to the people of God. They were warned about this very thing. To be pursued, as it says here at the end of verse 3, in the terminology of these covenant curses, is a way of expressing that one will be on the side of the losing side of the war. In Deuteronomy 28, verse 25, it says, the Lord shall cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You will go out one way against them, but you will flee 7 ways before them, and you will be an example of terror to all the kingdoms of the earth. Then Leviticus 26, verse 36 says, and for those of you who may be left, I will also bring weakness into the hearts of, in the lands of your, in their hearts in the land of their enemies, and the sound of a driven leaf will chase them. And even when no one is pursuing, they will flee as though from the sword, and they will fall. So once again, the rejection of the good that God offers, or the rejection of God himself, will lead to this judgment where the enemies will pursue the people of God. Verse 4, Hosea 8, verse 4, God says, they have set up kings, but not by me. They have appointed princes, but I did not know it. With their silver and gold, they have made idols for themselves, that they might be cut off. With verse 4 here begins a specification of Israel's sins in rejecting the good or the good one. First described here are crimes against the covenant in the areas of the governance of the nation as well as its worship. The Israelites have claimed for themselves the right to install or depose kings. King, of course, was to be God's representative or regent, not the people's choice. When God says here in the middle of verse 4, they have appointed princes, but I did not know it. It's not inferring here that God had no idea this was going to happen. What's going on here, it says Hosea and his readers were well aware that God knew what they were doing. The point is not whether God was aware of the princes they had set up, but rather that the people had never asked him for guidance before choosing these leaders. The second half of the verse attacks the practice of idolatry. As verse 5 is going to make clear in a moment, the calf or bull of gold was the most obvious manifestation of these idols. But there were others. When it says that with their silver and gold, they have made idols for themselves. It was a widespread thing though. Hosea 13 verse 2 will say, and now they sin more and more and make for themselves molten images, idols skillfully made from their silver, all of them the work of craftsmen. They say of them, let the men who sacrifice kiss the calves. This idolatry, of course, just leads to their cutting off of God. The text gives the impression that they made the idols for this purpose. And it says, with their silver and gold, they have made idols for themselves that they might be cut off. The language here, I think, though, it isn't as if Israel set out to do this. The language is ironic and sarcastic on the part of God, bringing out the futility of their efforts. One could paraphrase the end of verse 4. In essence, God is saying they made idols, but only so that they might be destroyed. Though they had other plans for the idols, God's judgment would bring their intentions to naught. The sense is that the Israelites invite their own doom by their outrageously foolish disobedience. Verse 5. He has rejected your calf, O Samaria, saying, my anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? So as Israel has rejected God, that's what we read back in verse 3, so now God has rejected the bull of Samaria. The word used in the original is the same in verse 3 and verse 5, this idea of rejection. Archaeologists have found sculptures of Baal standing on a bull. This calf idol is reminiscent of the calf idol made by Aaron in Exodus 32, verses 1 through 4. You remember that story. At Mount Sinai, Moses goes up on the mountain to get the law of God, but things go south in the camp. It says, now when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, come, make us a God who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Aaron said to them, tear off the gold rings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons and daughters, and bring them to me. Then all the people tore off the gold rings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took this from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made it into a molten calf. And they said, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. It also could make reference again, this calf worship in the northern kingdom would go back to the division of the kingdom between the north and the south at the time of the first Jeroboam. In 1 Kings 12, verses 28 and 29, it says, so the king consulted, and that'd be Jeroboam in the north, and made 2 golden calves, and he said to them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. He set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. So calf worship has been in the northern kingdom for a long time. And it doesn't make any difference where they thought, well, we'll make this idol and worship the true God, or whether the foreign gods were involved. It was probably both. But because of this idolatry, as it says here in verse 5, God is furious at Israel. He can be a jealous God in opposition to idolatry, and his fury is aroused on those occasions when Israel turns to idolatry. In the 10 Commandments, in Exodus 20, verse 5, God, speaking of graven images, says, you shall not worship them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. So from the very beginning of the nation, God had made it clear. Don't worship any graven images. Don't worship false idols. I'm a jealous God. There's no doubt here that he's furious because of that. It happened throughout all of Israel's history. In Numbers 25, verse 3, it says, So Israel joined themselves to Baal of Peor, and the Lord was angry at Israel. Deuteronomy 11, verses 16 through 17. Beware that your hearts are not deceived, that you do not turn away and serve other gods and worship them, or the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you. He will shut up the heavens so there will be no rain on the ground, and the ground, rather, will not yield its fruit, and you will perish quickly from the good land which the Lord has given you. This phrase at the end of verse 5, how long will they be incapable of innocence? God here really asks a bitter question. The question, how long, can be a rhetorical way of expressing the yearning of an unfulfilled hope, but it can also express, as I believe it is here, the impatience of God with this annoying situation. Israel could not seem to avoid guilt. Innocence, if you will, had become beyond their ability. How long will they be incapable of innocence? This was a willful incapability. All right, verse 8. Hosea 8, verse 6, rather. For from Israel is even this, a craftsman made it, so it is not God. Surely the calf of Samaria will be broken to pieces. That which a craftsman, a human craftsman, has manufactured can hardly be the true God, yet the Israelites believed it so. As a background to the phrase not God, let's read Deuteronomy 32, verse 21. It says, They have made me jealous. This is God speaking. They have made me jealous with what is not God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are not a people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. Over and over again, of course, the scriptures highlight the folly of worshiping something made with human hands. It's a typical theme throughout the prophets. You can take time later and read places like Isaiah 2, verse 8 and 20, Isaiah 40, verses 18 through 20, Isaiah 44, verses 9 through 20, and then Jeremiah 10, verses 1 through 16. In each of those cases, it speaks of just the utter folly of a craftsman making an idol, in some cases talking about cooking his food over part of the wood, and yet bowing down before the things that he has made. Yet the incongruity of worshiping a statue made by human hands was ignored by Israel in favor of the standard system used by all the other nations. Israel could not stand alone even in this most basic feature of its covenant with God, the exclusive worship of an invisible God. Since Israel had not destroyed their idols as the law required, guess what? God will now do it for them. God commanded them when they went into Canaan the first time, destroy all the idols. But like they did in a lot of other things, they didn't complete the task, and now it's enveloped them. God says, well, if you're not going to do it, I'll do it. Surely the calf of Samaria will be broken into pieces. Verse 7, Hosea 8, verse 7. God says, for they sow the wind, and they reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads, it yields no grain. Should it yield, strangers would swallow it up. So God will hardly stop with the calf idol. The people themselves must be punished. Verse 7 here contains 3 brief futility curses in which expectations are thwarted before they can be realized. The first saying, when it says they sow the wind and reap the whirlwind, reflects the futility curse of Deuteronomy 28, verse 38. There it says, you shall bring much seed to the field, but you will gather in little, for the locust will consume it. See, in ancient times, sowers would throw their seed onto the tilled up ground, and often they would do it in a gentle wind, which helped to scatter it evenly on a tilled field. The disaster, which brings to naught the planning and effort of the sower, is seen in the whirlwind, disintegrating and scattering the heads of grain before they can be harvested. Bad weather, the bane of farmers, will function as the agent of God's judgment on Israel. There is a possibility, though, of this entire saying being a figure of speech, since wind is often used in this Bible as a metonymy for foolishness, worthless behavior, or goals, and appears in Hosea in connection with the driving force of a prostituting spirit. The saying follows a sowing reaping format otherwise well known. Places like Proverbs 11:18, where it says, "The wicked earns deceptive wages, but he who sows righteousness will get a true reward." Proverbs 22, verse 8, "He who sows iniquity will reap vanity, and the rod of his fury will perish." So once again, perhaps that's the idea here. Sow the wind, reap the whirlwind. Israel here is reaping the whirlwind for their sin. It's like the New Testament says in Galatians 6:7, "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, he will also reap." The second saying here in verse 7 also employs a futility curse format and maybe even build upon the first. When it says the standing grain has no heads, the grain without a head will produce no flowers, hardly a new revelation, but it makes a serious point. If God causes the stalks to yield no grain, or if the yield is destroyed, famine will result. The third curse describes how, right at the end of the verse, how foreigners will devour what the Israelites have planted. Should it yield, strangers would swallow it up. This motif follows almost exactly the Mosaic covenant curses about the failing of their crops. The enemy, verse 3, will get what Israel worked for, and Israel's dependence on the pagan cults will have proved to be a tragic failure. There seems here in this verse to be a progression in the futility, right? If you make it past one, there's another waiting. You can sow, but you'll reap the whirlwind. If there are some seeds that take root, it will bear no grain. And if there are some seeds that bring grain to fruition, the strangers, the enemy, will swallow it up. There's no winning for Israel at this point. Verse 8, Israel is swallowed up. They are now among the nations like a vessel in which no one delights. This verse may recall the figure back in verse 1 of the eagle or vulture, this bird of prey about to devour. Israel's international entanglements are likened to the sort of miserable existence they will have when scattered among the nations for their infidelity. Their scattering among the nations is metaphorically a devouring of Israel. Leviticus 26:38 says, "But you will perish among the nations, and your enemies' lands will consume you." Lamentations 2, verse 5, "The Lord has become like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all its palaces. He has destroyed its strongholds and multiplied in the daughter of Judah mourning and moaning." So once again, God using Assyria, but it's God who's doing the swallowing up or devouring ultimately. Thus, Israel was already beginning to experience the enforcement of these curses. They were, according to verse 8, among the nations and unwanted. They were seeking these foreign alliances, but it was just to their mockery. Their own flip-flop foreign policy had been a major factor leading to their current dilemma. Once Israel was great. Now it was helplessly floundering among those from whom it had desperately but futilely sought aid. The term here in verse 8, when it says, "in which no one delights," like a vessel in which no one delights, in Jeremiah 22, verse 28, it describes the sad status of the deposed king Jehoiachin in exile. Jeremiah 22, verse 28, this would be the Judean king at that point in history. It says, "Is this man Coniah a despised, shattered jar, or is he an undesirable vessel? Why have he and his descendants been hurled out and cast into a land they have not known?" Then Jeremiah 48, verse 38 says, "On all the housetops of Moab and in its streets there is lamentation everywhere. For I have broken Moab like an undesirable vessel." Of course, perhaps the picture here is is, again, a lot of their vessels were made of clay and they would be useful, but if they would develop a crack or a leak, they were good for nothing, but just to be broken down and used for something else. This undesirable vessel. Israel has become this undesirable vessel in the hands of God. Verse 9, Hosea 8, verse 9. For they, Israel, have gone up to Assyria like a wild donkey all alone. Ephraim has hired lovers. Israel's national disloyalty was manifest most dramatically in its appeal to alliances with other nations. The appeal to Assyria here was presumably that which was made by King Hosea in 732 BC upon assuming power in order to stop the total conquest of Israel by Tiglath-Pileser II. Ephraim, or Israel, is called the donkey that is all alone. Use of the word here may recall the poetic promise of God to Ishmael in Genesis 16:12, where donkey conveys a sense of one isolated and at enmity with others. We're speaking of these wild animals. Israel has become that. Genesis 16:12, speaking of Ishmael, says, he will be a wild donkey of a man, his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live to the east of all his brothers. And these wild animals were often a picture of despair and being alone. God says Israel's going to be like that. They've wandered off to Assyria. The second part of the verse, when it says Ephraim has hired lovers, finds a striking parallel in Jeremiah 2, verses 23 through 25, which is set in the midst of a series of pictures describing Israel's unfaithfulness. Jeremiah 2, verses 23 through 25. Notice the picture here, and it involves a wild donkey as well. It says, how can you say I'm not defiled? I have not gone after the Baals. Look at your way in the valley. Know what you have done. You are a swift young camel untangling her ways, a wild donkey accustomed to the wilderness that sniffs the wind in her passion. In the time of her heat, who can turn her away? All who seek her will not become weary. In her month, they will find her. Keep your feet from being unshod and your throat from thirst. But you said it is hopeless. No, for I've loved strangers, and after them I will walk. But Israel, again, was determined at several times in their history to chase after these foreign lovers, in a sense, hiring them. As they were prostituting themselves, but it wasn't that like they were getting money. They had to pay others to love them. In Hosea 8:9 here, the nation is in danger from its foes. Easy prey for those who have the resources to hire its love, whether Egypt or, at the point this prophecy was delivered, Assyria. All right, verse 10. Even though they hire allies among the nations, now I will gather them up, and they will begin to diminish because of the burden of the king of princes. The first part of the verse portrays the Israelites as dispersed figuratively through seeking help from foreign alliances. The gathering here is a gathering up by God for judgment of the accursed. Wherever they have sold themselves, God is saying, I will gather them for punishment. That's the sense. The second part of verse 10 speaks implicitly of the coming exile. It speaks features of the judgment Israel will receive at the hand of God. The nation's independence will be taken away, its own rulers deposed, and it will be subject to the dominion of its enemies. Now we'll move on to verse 11. Hosea 8, verse 11. Since Ephraim has multiplied altars for sin, they have become altars of sinning for him. The sin and rebellion of Israel obviously displeased God. In the next few verses here in chapter 8, multiple altars, that's verse 11, disregard for the laws, verse 12, and the love of sacrifice or feasts, verse 13, are all reproached. The system of multiple altars was an inheritance from the Canaanite system. In Hosea 4:13, you remember God says they offer sacrifices on the tops of the mountains and burn incense on the hills under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is pleasant. Therefore, your daughters play the harlot, and your brides commit adultery. So the sense there is God, it says your idolatry has been widespread. You've got these places of worship all over. Well, that's what's referenced here with these multiple altars for sin. It was a violation, of course, of the covenant stipulation of a single sanctuary. Remember, in places like Deuteronomy 12, God had been clear. His people were to come to Jerusalem. There was that altar where they were supposed to worship. The Ephraimites, of course, had built and rebuilt altars all over their territory, but their altars became, in fact, a means for sin. Without an altar, there was hardly a means of worship under the old covenant. Knowing this full well, as we read earlier, or we just mentioned earlier, Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom, had instituted the beginnings of the multiple altar system in the north immediately upon taking the throne. 1 Kings 12, verses 26 through 33. Remember, altar in Bethel and Dan. It was too far, he said, to go to Jerusalem to worship. And that's where God said they would offer their worship. So it started early in Israel, this multiple altar system, and it's just proliferated since then. These altars then became places to sin rather than places to be forgiven. The altar should have been a place to approach God to seek forgiveness. For Israel or Ephraim, these multiplied altars had just become places of sinning. Multiplied altars became multiplied venues for continued sinning. Verse 12, God says, "For though I wrote for him 10,000 precepts of my law, they are regarded as a strange thing." God here declares that the Israelites are ignoring his laws. The problem for Israel was not a lack of God's laws, but the fact that they flagrantly disregarded them. It seems to me there's an obvious hyperbole here on the part of God. Others have went through and counted maybe some 613 or so laws in the Old Covenant. Here, God is speaking in an exaggerated way. Again, I wrote 10,000 precepts of my law, but it doesn't matter how many he wrote because Israel was flagrantly disregarding them. The point is that it wouldn't matter how many laws God gave Israel, they were determined to ignore them. The saddest part of the verse, of course, is the last part when it says that these laws of God are regarded as a strange thing. That's a haunting statement when you think about it. God's people had fallen so far into their sin and rebellion that the laws of God were viewed as strange things. This word strange here in the original language is the same word used in Leviticus 10, verse 1, when it speaks of Nadab and Abihu offering strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. In Deuteronomy 13, verse 16, it says, speaking of looking ahead and looking ahead at the rebellion of his people, it says, "They made him jealous with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger." It's exactly what this chapter is about. Jeremiah 5:19 says, "It shall come about when they say, 'Why has the Lord our God done all these things to us?' Then you shall say to them, 'As you have forsaken me and served foreign gods in your land, so you will serve strangers in a land that is not yours.'" You see what's going on there? God says, well, if you think my laws are strange, then I'll punish you, and you will serve strangers in places like Assyria and Babylon. In Israel during Hosea's day, since priest and prophet were negligent in publicizing the law or teaching the law among the people, we saw that back in chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, and we talked there about part of the problem here is that the teachers of Israel weren't teaching the laws of God as they should. The problem had grown to where now they had become, in fact, a stranger foreign thing to the citizenry. And what a sad thing among the people of God to view his laws as a strange thing. Verse 13, God says, "As for my sacrificial gifts, they sacrifice the flesh and eat it, but the Lord has taken no delight in them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish them for their sins, and they will return to Egypt." This verse speaks of God's displeasure with Israel's sacrifice feast system, which had come virtually and an end in itself rather than a renewal of communion with God. Though Israel went through the proper motions, God was still displeased. Their confidence rested not in him, but in the offering system, which they believed sure to work if attended to diligently. But their sacrifices could never be acceptable. Why is that? Because they were offered by unrepentant people, corrupted by their iniquity and sins. Hosea 5:6 says, "They will go with their flocks and herds to seek the Lord, but they will not find him. He has withdrawn from them." So again, the idea here, even if the Israelites in the midst of their sin and rebellion were still going through the motions of offering sacrifices to God, God says, I'm not going to take it. I'm not going, I won't accept them. In chapter 9, when we get there, verse 4, God says, they will not pour out drink offerings of wine to the Lord. Their sacrifices will not please him. Their bread will be like mourner's bread. All who eat of it will be defiled, for their bread will be for themselves alone. It will not enter the house of the Lord. The Israel of Hosea's day seems not to have understood this concept. If an Israelite was ritually unclean, he or she could not appear rightly before God's altar to sacrifice. But Israel was unclean at this point, not from contact with something dead or diseased, but from sin itself. They might bring their sacrifice and eat its meat, but it would not work for any good. The nature of God's punishment here is made explicit in the prediction, behold, they will return to Egypt. Why should this judgment be expressed in the terms of a return to Egypt? Well, more likely it's because Egypt here is being simply used as a figure of speech for captivity or exile or bondage, which was the fate awaiting Israel for their callous disregard of the many laws of God. God initially, in the formation of the nation, brought them out of bondage to Egypt. Now, because of their sin, God himself is going to be thrusting them back into figurative Egypt in Assyria. Verse 14, for Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities. But I will send a fire on its cities that it may consume its palatial dwellings. The verse here is a covenantal judgment in brief. It speaks of the vast building of sanctuaries, maybe even royal dwellings, and fortifying the cities of the north and the south. In these things, Israel and eventually Judah, they both trusted for their spiritual and political military security. This appears to be a way of summarizing what Deuteronomy 32, verses 15 through 18 predicts in essence, that the people of Israel will turn from God to rely upon their own devices, confident in their own accomplishment. Hear what is said in Deuteronomy 32, verses 15 through 18. A bit of a history lesson here in Deuteronomy 32. It says, but Jeshurun, and that's just another name for the people of God, on the heels of God's blessing them, says, but Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You are grown fat, thick, and sleek. Then they forsook God who made him and scorned the rock of his salvation. They made him jealous with strange gods. With abominations, they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons who are not gods, to gods whom they have not known, new gods who came lately, whom your fathers did not dread. You neglected the rock who begot you and forgot the God who gave you birth. That's this idea here in verse 14 of Israel has forgotten its maker and went on to trust these other things. But trust, of course, in found fortifications and sanctuaries cannot ultimately save a disobedient nation. It just brings the judgment of God. The destruction here, of course, is characterized as fire from God. It symbolizes divine wrath. God says, but I will send a fire on these cities and these palatial dwellings that they're putting their trust in. Deuteronomy 32, verse 22 says, for a fire will be kindled by my wrath, one that burns down to the realm of the dead below. It will devour the earth or land and its harvests and set afire the foundations of the mountains. Apocalyptic language there, just describing the judgment that would come at the hands of the Assyrians by the direction of God. The proximate origin of the fire will be, of course, these enemy troops burning everything in the cities that will burn. Again, the way of the attacking Assyrian army. The true ultimate origin, though, of this wrathful fire, this judgment fire, will be God, who, as it says, judges by fire among many other things. So this chapter 8 here draws to a close. Once again, some harsh words of judgment God predicts to Hosea upon the nation of Israel for its sin. And of course, there's some things for us to learn as well. The power, of course, of sin to draw us away from God and ultimately have us reach the point where we pay no attention to God and ignore Him. And such sin and rebellion always brings the judgment of God. And we must be faithful, of course, to avoid the same problem that Israel was having here. Consider these things. Again, if you have some time, study ahead into chapter 9, and Lord willing, next lesson we'll pick up there. God bless. Have a great week.